They thought you weren't paying attention. That while they moved behind curtains and whispered half-truths, you were too busy staying polite, too disciplined in your silence, too distracted by your kindness. They thought your stillness meant blindness. That because you didn't interrupt, you didn't interpret. But what they never calculated was the depth of your awareness, the slow, venomous build of your understanding. You weren't collecting gossip. You were gathering patterns. Every inconsistency, every flicker of contradiction, every overplayed gesture, they were data points. You let them believe they were operating in secrecy, when in truth, you were simply giving them rope, letting them get comfortable in their own delusion. Because you didn't need to catch them red-handed. You were building something colder, a truth they could neither dismiss nor defend against. When you finally opened your mouth, the air shifted. Not because you raised your voice, but because the weight of what you carried rearranged the atmosphere. It wasn't a rant. It wasn't a meltdown. It was surgical, controlled, precise. You weren't looking to humiliate. You were revealing the truth they swore would never surface. And you didn't do it to destroy them. You did it to liberate yourself. They had painted you into a quiet corner, expecting you to forever nod and smile. But what they forgot is that still waters do not equate to still minds. You had been working in silence, not out of fear, but out of respect for your own evolution. And when the moment came, you didn't speak out of emotion. You spoke from evidence. And that's what broke their faces. They expected fragility. You gave them fire. The kind of fire that doesn't flicker with rage, but burns steady with fact. You didn't embellish. You didn't dramatize. You simply laid it all out. Every lie, every manipulation, every strategic omission they'd use like a scalpel behind your back. And you didn't flinch while doing it. You watched them squirm. You watched their expressions collapse under the weight of your calm. You watched people in the room freeze, not because you were aggressive, but because truth spoken without hesitation is louder than any shout. That moment didn't just expose them, it transformed you. Because once you tell the truth with that level of poise, you're no longer capable of being treated like anything less than a storm dressed in restraint. It wasn't just what you said, it was how you said it. Your tone didn't tremble. Your eyes didn't wander. There was no bitterness in your voice, only clarity. That was the part that made them panic. Because when people expect confrontation, they prepare for noise. But when you speak like you've already healed, like you've already let go, they have nothing to latch onto. No drama to weaponize. No emotion to exploit. Just the raw, exposed architecture of their own deceit. And what made it worse? You didn't name call. You didn't insult. You simply walked them through the reality they had tried so hard to bury. And it wasn't just the people being exposed who felt the shift. It was everyone who had been complicit by staying silent while they thrived. There's a certain psychological brutality in truth spoken without need for validation. That's what they couldn't process. You weren't asking to be believed. You weren't trying to prove your worth. You already knew what you saw, and that self-certainty is dangerous in a world addicted to gaslighting. You made them face themselves without force. You turned the room into a mirror, and all they could see was their reflection looking back. Distorted, desperate, cornered. They always thought the upper hand was theirs. That by keeping you confused, they could keep you controlled. But clarity is a rebellion. And you didn't just find clarity, you became it. After that moment, nothing returned to normal. You walked out of the room with no theatrics, no grand declaration, just presence. That's what lingered. Not the words, but the weight. The people who had once looked at you as the soft one now couldn't meet your gaze. And the ones who whispered against you began to retreat into silence. Not out of respect, but shame. You didn't expose them for revenge. You exposed them because truth has a shelf life, and theirs had long expired. You let them age their deception until it became undeniable. Then, with a single conversation, you uncorked the bottle. Let everyone taste it. They weren't afraid of your voice. They were afraid of your timing. You waited. That's what made the impact lethal. You didn't strike when you were angry. You struck when you were grounded. And they weren't prepared for a version of you that didn't need them anymore. Not emotionally, not socially, not strategically. You dismantled their control not by screaming louder, but by never needing their permission to speak again. That shift in dynamic, they still haven't recovered. Because now every room you enter, you carry a reputation of someone who knows and chooses when to show it. You became a question mark wrapped in calm, and that unsettles every liar who thought they had you mapped. You didn't just tell the truth. You embodied it. And when someone becomes truth in motion, they become a threat to systems that thrive on distortion. That's why the room fell silent. That's why their jaws dropped. Not because they were surprised by what you knew, but because you knew it all and never flinched while delivering it. You walked into a space they thought they ruled and rearranged the entire hierarchy with a single conversation. That's not drama. That's power. Not the loud, crumbling kind they're used to, but the kind that reshapes memory. The kind that makes people question everything they thought they understood about you. It changes the air when someone reveals they were awake the entire time. That every interaction was recorded, not on tape, but in pattern. You weren't emotional. You were methodical. You watched their inconsistencies stack like glass towers. You let them think they were safe, let them mock you in your absence. Let them build their fortress on false assumptions. And then, one day, you walked through their front door, handed them their blueprint, and left it there. No threat, no demand, just a mirror. And in that mirror, they finally saw what you saw all along, the facade, the performance, the fear beneath the arrogance. It wasn't just what you said, it was how you said it. The cadence was too calm, the tone too steady. You didn't stumble. You didn't pause to search for words. You spoke like someone who had already rehearsed the conversation 1,000 times in silence, but not out of obsession, out of discipline, out of precision. There was no desperation in your delivery. You weren't trying to convince. You weren't hoping they'd believe you. You were simply stating facts that had been carved into your mind by years of observation and surgical clarity. And that's what broke them. Not the content, but the composure. Because liars expect emotion. They expect your voice to crack. They expect heat. But when you came with ice, slow, deliberate, irrefutable, they panicked. Because you weren't reacting, you were revealing. Your tone wasn't loud, but it pierced. It had gravity. It made the air heavier. The walls closer, the silence after each sentence feel like judgment. Every syllable hit with restraint, which is more terrifying than rage, because rage can be dismissed. Rage can be labeled. But when someone speaks with complete detachment, with no emotional tether to the outcome, you know they've already walked away internally. You were done long before the words left your lips. And that was the wound they couldn't bandage. You weren't speaking for closure. You were delivering consequence. They didn't just hear you. They felt the finality behind every line. The kind of finality that doesn't beg for a response, because it no longer needs anything from them, not even understanding. You weren't emotional, and that's what made your words lethal. Because you spoke like someone who had already buried their emotional reactions long ago, someone who had processed every betrayal, every manipulation, and reduced it to raw data. You didn't speak from pain. You spoke from pattern. You didn't sob. You cited. Your voice didn't shake, it sharpened, like a blade, not a bell. And they were left disoriented, because they had spent so long crafting a version of you that was fragile, nabava, over-invested. And now here you were, articulate, unshaken, and clearly 2 steps ahead. You weren't responding, you were educating. And education hurts when people are forced to learn how clearly you've seen them all along. There's a violence to composure, not the kind that lashes out, but the kind that exposes without effort. You didn't insult them. You didn't exaggerate. You didn't storm out or slam the table. You sat still, and the stillness screamed. Because when someone is still while speaking the kind of truth that can split a room in half, every word becomes a scalpel. You sliced with precision, not because you wanted to wound, but because you had finally stopped protecting. You stopped filtering. stopped cushioning their egos. You gave them the full, undiluted version of everything you had watched quietly. And it wasn't vengeance. It was liberation. For you. For everyone in the room who had been taught to swallow their voice. What haunted them most was the realization that this version of you had been there all along. That you weren't becoming someone new. You were finally revealing what had been restrained. You hadn't changed. You had arrived. And the timing was brutal. Because now they couldn't deflect. Couldn't mislabel you. You weren't in a reactive state. You were in full command. You weren't chaotic. You were composed. And nothing terrifies manipulators more than a target that no longer bleeds on cue. You had rebuilt yourself to become immune. And that immunity gave your words the sting of something holy. Your delivery didn't need decoration. No poetic fury. No long-winded explanations. Just truths, each dropped like iron into water. Dense, immediate, sinking straight to the bottom. You didn't circle around the issue. You named it clearly. You didn't quote anyone else. You didn't ask permission to speak. And with each revelation, you stripped their story bare. Not just for yourself, but for everyone watching. The ones who were silent. The ones who were confused. The ones who needed proof. Your voice gave it to them. And the worst part, you weren't performing. You weren't trying to be believed. You were already beyond needing that. They tried to interrupt. Of course they did. That's what cowards do when the truth gets too close. They talked over you, tried to shift the narrative, tried to change your tone. But you didn't adjust. You didn't raise your voice to compete. You let the silence that followed their deflection carry more weight than their noise ever could, because you had mastered not just what to say, but when to say it. You waited until the room was listening, until their masks were worn thin from repetition, until your absence had been felt deeply enough to make your return seismic. And when you finally spoke, it didn't sound like a speech. It sounded like a verdict. You spoke like someone who had nothing left to lose, because you already lost the version of yourself that would have tolerated another lie, another half apology, another performance. And that loss wasn't sad, it was sacred. It had carved you into someone exact, someone who now used truth like a surgeon uses steel. Not to harm, but to remove what no longer belongs. You weren't bitter. You were accurate. And when accuracy is paired with elegance, it shakes people to their core. Because there's no defense against grace weaponized by clarity. No escape from someone who doesn't want revenge, only reality. You let them think they were safe, that was the art. Not to confront, not to warn, not to react, but to watch. The game began when you said nothing. When you let their arrogance inflate. When you let them believe they had mapped your mind, cornered your spirit, and mastered the rhythm of your reactions. They mistook your silence for surrender, your patience for paralysis. They danced boldly because they assumed you had no music left. But in truth, you were the composer. And while they were celebrating what they thought was your collapse, you were adjusting the lighting, shaping the acoustics, preparing the finale. Because power, real power, doesn't announce itself with volume. It waits in the wings, smiling. They didn't notice the way your eyes changed, how your kindness sharpened into courtesy, how your warmth shifted into neutrality. They thought they still had access, that your forgiveness was infinite, that you were too emotionally entangled to pull away, and so they became sloppy, greedy, predictable. They repeated themselves, confident you hadn't been keeping score. But your memory was built in layers. You weren't holding grudges, you were holding patterns. You weren't watching for revenge, you were watching for when. And once you had enough proof, you didn't explode. You didn't confront. You simply stepped back and let the gravity of their own actions collapse the house they built. You let them feel comfortable because their confidence revealed more truth than confrontation ever could. It exposed what they truly thought of you. It unmasked the nature of their loyalty. It showed you who they became when they thought you were beneath them. That's why you didn't intervene. Because people reveal their entire psychology when they believe there's no consequence. They get careless with their manipulation, bold with their dismissal, Theatrical in their betrayal, they forget that even silence has a memory. You let them talk, boast, plot. You gave them the illusion of safety, so they'd expose themselves fully. Because the deadliest trap is the one that requires no force, only time. They underestimated your detachment, thought you still cared in the same way, that you'd beg, that you'd chase, that you'd explain. But what they failed to understand was this. You weren't bitter, you were bored. You weren't waiting for them to apologize. You were waiting for them to finish building their stage. And when they did, you handed them the script they didn't know you'd written. You didn't have to improvise. You already knew their lines. You had studied their patterns. Not with vengeance, but with precision. And once they stepped too far into their own mythology, you erased your presence. That absence, that sudden, irreversible lack of you, became the echo that unraveled them. You knew exactly how far to lean in before stepping away. You knew how much access to allow before sealing the doors. It was never about playing games. It was about recognizing the nature of the opponent. They were addicted to your attention, dependent on your reaction. So you gave them what they needed, just enough attention to keep them confident, just enough silence to make them think you had nothing to say. Meanwhile, every conversation became a confession. Every laugh became a timestamp. You weren't seeking confrontation. You were letting the room speak for itself.